Good evening. Welcome. My name is Lynn Campbell. I'm the Director of the Office for Catholic Social Justice Ministry of the Archdiocese of Hartford. Thank you for joining in on a conversation about being broke in America. I invite you to put your name in the chat box and let us know where you're from and if you are involved in any anti-poverty programs. If you have questions for our panelists this evening, please use the Q&A box. There will be time for questions at the end of the program. This year is the year of St. Joseph as proclaimed by our Pope, and St. Joseph has been known, as, among other things, as the patron saint of workers. And so our panelists tonight will have a little bit of a focus on work and poverty. But as we always do, I like to begin with a very quick prayer that I will share with you. It is a prayer for workers. Loving and gracious God, help us to build a new world in the midst of the old, a world where all workers are valued, a world where those who clean houses are able to buy houses to live in, a world where those who grow food can also afford to eat their fill. With St. Joseph as our guide, help us to do right by workers. Bless all of us as we continue working to bring forth your vision of justice and peace. Amen. So tonight I am very pleased to have with us the authors of Broken America, Colleen Shattucks and Joanne Goldblum, as well as Jered Bruzas, to provide some on-the-ground experience of poverty in Connecticut. And I will just briefly introduce you. Colleen Shattucks is a print and radio journalist and activist. Her publication credits include the New York Times, the Washington Post, the National Public Radio, America, and many more. She left daily newspapers when an editor reprimanded her for writing too many stories about poor people, and then went to work in a soup kitchen. She has one foot in journalism and the other foot in nonprofits ever since. Joanne Goldblum is CEO and founder of the National Diaper Bank Network, encompassing more than 200 member organizations that provide diapers and other basic needs to families across America. Joanne has spent her career working with and advocating for families in poverty. She has written several op-eds for the Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, and Huffington Post. She has been ABC Person of the Week and the subject of profiles by CNN, People, and many other outlets. Jered Bruzas currently serves at St. Vincent DePaul Mission in Waterbury as a director of operations. He began working there back in 2006 when he had the opportunity to work with Father Cascia, who is the founder of the mission. He has been working with those who are homeless since 2012, first as case manager, and then as the Homeless Resource Center and Shelter Director. Jered fights for the rights of the homeless, is an outspoken advocate for those experiencing homelessness in the greater Waterbury area. We're going to start with Jered, and maybe you can perhaps just talk a little bit about what is poverty, define poverty, what does poverty look like?
Thank you, Lynn. So some define poverty as the state of somebody who lacks the usual acceptable amount of money or material possessions or needs for the society. And kind of the experience that I've witnessed to, and the folks that we have worked with or that I have worked with is poverty looks in many different ways for different folks based upon what their needs are. But there are some core elements of people experiencing many different challenges. And so the material poverty that many of our folks that are experiencing now, finding just to be much more greater so now than have experienced before in the past. And some of that I believe is due to some of the programs, state, federal, local programs that are out there, which may be intended to do good, but at the same time have some really great limitations on their ability to provide some core services for folks that are in most need. And in doing so, especially here in Connecticut, the bar is raised quite high, with sort of the standard of living that we have here being a little higher than, say, like in Alabama or Mississippi, where folks are making $7.50 an hour, and universal guidelines for poverty levels are set based off of national standards. Unfortunately, here in Connecticut, folks that are experiencing poverty here in Connecticut are kind of not being able to receive some of the same benefit of some of the mainstream systems and services and benefit programs as other folks, because they're deemed over income, but yet don't really necessarily have enough resources to provide for themselves.
Thank you. I think we'll get into a little bit more about some of those policies. But I mentioned that we wanted to talk about work and poverty, because it sounds very simple. Work should be a way out of poverty. Yet I learned through your book that most of adults living in poverty are actually employed. Colleen, would you like to address that? What's going on here?
Sure. They're employed, but they're not making a living wage. When we looked back at worker wages from the 1970s forward, really the average line worker gained about 10% over those decades, whereas a CEO gained more than 900%. At the same time, healthcare costs went up more than 100%. Housing costs went up more than 100%. So wages really aren't keeping pace with what it costs to provide for a family or even an individual. So it's a recipe for poverty. It's really, it's no surprise. And when we talk about benefits that supplement that, I think it's really important to frame it as, when we talk about SNAP or Section 8 and so on, whenever a person who is employed is getting those, we're not subsidizing that family. We're subsidizing their employer, who doesn't actually have to pay them a living wage. And I think very often our anger is not directed quite in the right direction when that question comes up.
In the book, you also talk about a cycle of you're sick because you're poor because you're sick, and then if you're sick, you can't work. Joanne or Colleen, would you like to say a little more about that?
Sure. It really ran its way through the entire book, because the truth is that when you're poor, everything is harder. Working, staying healthy, keeping your house, finding food, all of those things. In our book, we have these bizarre policy little blurbs or areas. And one of them is about sick leave in the United States. Paid leave, even though some states say that it's required, isn't really required for everybody. It isn't required in retail. It isn't required for part-time. It isn't required if you have less than 50 employees. So many workers in the US do not have paid time off. So it does mean that people are working sick. It means they're sending their kids to school sick, because they have to make the decision between being able to be paid for the day or losing that day's pay. And so many people are living so close to the edge. And on top of that, when you relate it to sort of being sick and being poor, our healthcare system is just so broken. In the US, we tend to equate access to healthcare with insurance coverage, and they're really not synonymous in the way that we treat them. So many people may have insurance, but still really don't have access to health care. And then you have many people who don't have insurance and are really using emergency rooms as their first line of defense, because those are the only places that will see you if you don't have insurance. So we really have a system that doesn't work for people who are not working in professional jobs, because those are the bulk of the jobs that have paid time off.
You know, I just want to add one thing. When you asked that question, that came immediately to my mind. I interviewed a woman who trains women on public assistance to do, I believe it was advanced manufacturing jobs, but a job with a career path and good wages and benefits. And she said in the winter, they stop coming to class because their apartments aren't heated, so they get sick. And if you miss 3 classes, you're out. And there's this real feeling that if a person in poverty is given an opportunity to work their way up, to do better, and they don't seize it 110%, then they lack motivation. It's their own fault. It's a lot easier to seize things 110% when you have a full belly and a warm place to sleep and transportation and so many other things that really stand between people and better paying work.
Well, and I think on top of that, what's really important is a safe and affordable access to childcare.
Mhm.
So again, so many people are not able to work because there's a child who needs care. And as a society, as a country, we really just don't address that.
Jered, what are you seeing as far as, the health of the clients at St. Vincent de Paul? Do you see association between their needing services and their health?
Yeah, absolutely. So upon entry of all of our programs, we do quite a bit of assessment to ensure we can meet the needs of our folks, and so they can also identify what are some of their barriers and strengths, and so we can support their needs. And some of the questions that we do ask do pertain to health. And of those that come, about 74% of our consumers in our programs report that they have some type of underlying health condition. So that's a strong indicator that something isn't right. Many of the folks, the majority of the folks that are coming to us, don't have access to healthcare, or even just basic Husky D health insurance, the Medicaid portion. So healthcare is for our folks sometimes it is non-existent. And the other reality is we're dealing with a large immigrant population that doesn't have any access to healthcare. So we're grateful for the Malta House of Care here in Waterbury that's down the street from our soup kitchen. We're able to refer folks. And I'm actually thankful I've got a Spanish-speaking APRN who volunteers at our food pantry and soup kitchen regularly, who is a great support. But that's not enough. And so many of our folks have very limited access to healthcare and resources. And for people who are experiencing homelessness, socks can be the difference between life and death. Socks for somebody who's diabetic and for the homeless who are walking all over God's creation that don't have access to transportation, bus passes, or their own vehicles, not having fresh, clean socks or shoes literally can be the difference between a blister, an ulcer, amputation, and so much more. So to Colleen's point, some of the folks that we do get into some of these programs that I agree are quite rigid. Many of the folks that are administering these programs don't realize how complex it is for some of our folks to navigate through systems and services to try to get themselves to the class on time and ready to participate adequately.
And I know many of our listeners are involved in parish ministries, and just a little plug that socks are what's needed. You're doing your collections this holiday season, send socks away. I want to circle back to Joanne. You started to talk a little bit about childcare, and perhaps you can share a little bit of your story of how that childcare got you launched into the National Diaper Bank Network.
Sure. So actually what got me launched into it, what you were just talking about, Jered. So for about 20 years, I've driven around with Ziploc bags filled with 2 pairs of men's underwear and 2 pairs of socks that I've given to people on the street, because in fact it is the thing. And it's why I started the diaper bank, the diaper bank, the New Haven diaper bank, and then it's morphed since that. But because I saw this concrete need that wasn't being addressed anywhere. And, when I first started the diaper bank in 2004, I was working as a social worker at Yale Child Study Center. I was doing community-based social work, so I, did home visiting. And what I saw over and over again was a level of poverty that even in Connecticut, even, a mile from where I dropped my kids off, I would be at people's homes without heat and hot water. I would see people take a diaper off and dump the solids out and put it back on their baby using rags as toilet paper, and it was impossible for me to accept the fact that there wasn't any answer to that problem except buying people the things that they needed. And I was working at Yale. I had great supervision. We spent a lot of time thinking about clinical issues. And I can tell you there is no clinical issue. There's no clinical response to not having toilet paper, to not having a diaper. The only response is to give people what they need. And so, I began to research it, and what became clear was a few things. One was that there really was a change in 1996 when President Clinton implemented welfare reform. We went from aid to families and dependent children to temporary assistance for needy families. And that really changed the tenor of cash welfare in the United States. Prior to that, you could get welfare. If you had a need, you could get cash assistance. And in 1996, that all changed, and we added the temporary aspect to it. And so what I found was a lot of the clients I was working with were living 100% on SNAP benefits, on food stamps. And so I found again and again that families, because they were living on SNAP benefits, first off, they didn't have nearly enough money, but also they couldn't buy certain things like diapers and period products, paper goods, cleaning supplies. And, what I learned is that makes sense. SNAP and WIC are federal programs. They're run out of the Department of Agriculture, and they are nutritional subsidies, and that's what they're meant to be. To pay for these other goods, we need to look at other programs. But our system wasn't set up that way because, as a rule, and this is what we talk about a lot in the book, the policies we have in place don't make sense for the problem we have. And so, I talked about this a lot. Finally, my husband and my mother were like, all right, let's give people diapers. So we started giving people diapers. And I would say the first month we gave out 5,000 diapers from my house in New Haven. And within 2 years, we were giving out about 1 million diapers a year. And by then I had left my job at Yale, and I worked as a volunteer executive director for the New Haven Diaper Bank for about 7 years. And then was able, because of the work that I was doing, a lot of people were interested in replicating it. And so I was lucky enough to team up with Huggies to found the National Diaper Bank Network. And now there are about 250 diaper banks across the country, really basic needs banks. They give out diapers, lots of them give out baby supplies, all sorts of kids' goods. Lots of them give out period products and other supplies that other people in the family might need. So really going from seeing that there was a problem that wasn't being addressed by a policy and trying to figure out a way to address it.
And so I think that's what I like about your book, is that you are courageous to talk about policies, right? And the way you frame poverty, it's not that people are making bad decisions or that these are individual situations, but rather poverty is often tied to policies and to money. And in your book, you provide action steps to go beyond temporary fixes, which as a social justice, we always talk about. There's charity, and then there's social action to get to the root causes, which are often policies, right? Long-term solutions. And you talked a lot about like really bizarre policies that are out there in our country. And any one of you be willing to share some of these bizarre policies with us and perhaps offer a suggestion on what we can do about them?
Well, one that comes to mind, since we're talking about workers, is when people are on public assistance, TANF, that Joanne referenced, a lot of the money doesn't actually go toward giving them money. It goes towards various programs. And there are training programs for people on public assistance to help them get jobs. So good thought. And most of that goes to getting them jobs as CNAs or home health aides. This is good, noble, important work, but it pays poverty wages.
Right.
So we train people to get jobs that will keep them in poverty. There used to be Perkins money, federal Perkins money, that went toward training women in non-traditional careers like construction jobs that paid better. And that has pretty much all dried up. So we're not training women in jobs that would actually help them support their families, but we are training them in jobs that we know will keep them in poverty indefinitely. That's just one. There's more.
Right. And I just spoke a few minutes ago about the one about, paid time off, and more than paid time off, couple that with the fact that we don't require people to have, shift work to be scheduled in advance. We really have set up a system where, particularly people with children are not able to adequately plan to be able to get to work. And that really is a policy decision that we've made not to require that.
Jered, we were having a discussion before we started just about minimum wage and the benefits and problems that presents.
Yeah, so unfortunately, in Connecticut, we're moving closer and closer to 15, which sounds great, but it's really even not enough for us here in Connecticut, right? So 15 sounds nice, but it's not nearly enough. The reality is our folks need to earn a considerable amount more of money than 15 in order to live in the state of Connecticut. But with that, unfortunately, we're discovering that some of our folks are no longer eligible for different types of assistance. So say, for example, you're staying at our shelter and you are working and you are working hard, full-time job, you're making minimum wage at right now $13 an hour. You're no longer eligible for assistance. You're no longer eligible for SNAP assistance. You're not eligible for Husky. And so after you factor in all the additional expenses and the increased cost of rent going up, somebody who's making $13 an hour in the state of Connecticut, in order just to pay their bare bones minimum bills they have, they'd have a pretty significant shortfall at the end of the month. So I was prepping earlier, and I was looking at some budgets that we do with some of our guests and some of our programs. And so I just took the budget. It's a nice pre-fill. I've done it many times with clients that I've worked with in the past. And I was doing the math. And at $13 an hour with a modest one-bedroom rent at $894, after everything is said and done, a single person would have a deficit of $2,000 a month in Waterbury just to live. So that's working. So that's full-time, $13 an hour, not eligible for anything. And so we couldn't even move them out of the shelter with those resources because they're not eligible for any rental assistance, any supportive housing, because unfortunately at that time they're deemed over income. So huge problem.
If I could just add to that, I think it's really important when we talk about that we're really clear that you're talking about sort of two different problems. I would hate for anybody to say, well, we shouldn't raise the minimum wage because it might bring some people over income. the problem of people being kicked off benefits because of the going over income exists in so many programs in the US. So I would say that what we need to do is advocate to change the levels at which people are eligible to match minimum wage. But you know, it really is very, very complicated. And as Colleen was talking about earlier, some of the programs are state and some are federal. So it's very difficult to sort of put them together. And the only reason that I feel like I need to say that is because really part of what we're trying to do in the book is make it so that policies make more sense to people. Because I think that as a country, we tend to sort of want to deal with things more broadly. And the truth is, our systems are just so separated, and so things are connected, but they're not from a policy standpoint.
I think it's really interesting that, so we're here honoring St. Joseph the Worker. And why do we honor St. Joseph the Worker? It's not because we care about the quality of carpentry in Nazareth 2,000 years ago, right? What St. Joseph did that was noble was he went out and worked every day to support the Holy Family. That is the inherent bargain in work, right? I give my employer most of my waking hours, and in return, I receive wages that should support my family. And that's just increasingly not the case for American workers. And that's absolutely unacceptable. The University of Washington does a really interesting self-sufficiency wage analysis where they look at market rents in a given community and food cost, et cetera. And they talk about what a living subsistence wage would be in that community. And I think it's above $15 in every community in the country. There may be some place in Kentucky where it's close, but it tends to be in the high 20s. And that's where we really need to do.
It's twice the federal poverty. It's not less than 200% of poverty anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
Which is, we could talk about the federal poverty level for a long time and how it's really badly calculated to make it look like poverty is a smaller problem in this country than it truly is.
And even with that poverty level, we still, 6% of our children are living in poverty here in the US. It's just unacceptable, really. All right, go back to the book again, Broken America. And you did a chapter on housing and how government cuts to housing happened during the 70s and early 80s. And before that time, we didn't have homeless shelters. I was just like, I never made the connections together. And I just found that very interesting. And maybe Colleen, you could speak a little bit about like that history as far as government programs ending and the need for nonprofits to start having shelters.
Yeah, so through the first part of the 20th century, the federal government considered it part of its mission to build affordable housing in communities around the country. And that wasn't a perfect system. There were all sorts of problems with that housing that are very well documented. But what the government decided to do in the early 80s was to kind of just stop building affordable housing. And there's really not a market incentive to do so, right? At some level, if you want housing to be affordable to low-wage workers, somebody's got to be fronting some cash. And, it's small nonprofits now in communities around the country, but they don't begin to have the scale to meet the need that the federal government once did. So we really saw this explosion in homelessness in the 1980s. And the problem hasn't gotten all that much better. And the problem is very often mischaracterized in the media. When you talk to people about homelessness, they're like, oh, well, they're on drugs or they have mental health problems. that may be true in some cases. It doesn't mean that you can't be in an apartment, right? I know middle-class people with mental health problems and drug problems that are perfectly well housed. We make things about the person when they are really about systems. And the fact of the matter is there just isn't enough affordable housing to go around in this country. We need to build more, and no one has come up with a better idea than having the federal government do it.
And, I think that what we talked about in the book in terms of shelters was that FEMA actually was the funder of sort of first resort then, right, Colleen?
Right. And so that's federal emergency management,
Right.
right? It's not an emergency. It's baked into the system. There is not enough affordable housing in this country for everyone who needs it.
So I also add to, even within the sheltered system, which should close, including mine, which is one of the largest in the state of Connecticut. I'd be happy to close a store someday, hopefully on my watch. But the reality is even the funding that we receive now is not nearly adequate to ensure that we can provide the needs of our consumers. So most folks think that shelters are fully funded, which they're not. The state of Connecticut provides about 42% of our budget. And so we have almost $1 million deficit at our shelter every year that we have to fundraise for. So, speaking of policy earlier, some of the challenge of the policy, with wage increases, which we strongly advocate for, and thankfully at our shelter we're fortunate not to pay anybody minimum wage, but yet the sources of revenue aren't coming in from the state and the federal government. Even with COVID, with all these relief dollars that are going around, they're not hitting some of the first responders, which we would definitely consider ourselves as part of the front line here. And so it's problematic. So while we definitely advocate for increased minimum wage, the reality is many shelters, and some shelters will close in the short term, even here in Connecticut, because the lack of funding from the state and federal government just to meet the basic needs. So then what? So even worse off now, the federal government, who used to provide support services, is providing very little to no resources. The state isn't providing the resource either. So it's really been off the backs of philanthropy and the generosity of people of goodwill that have been providing the needs for the homeless in the state of Connecticut.
So, and I think, philanthropy does have to be the answer because government is not. And that's why we have to advocate at the same time that we fundraise, because yes, the government should. And I think one thing that's interesting, if you look at sort of some of the history of philanthropy, there was a time in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s when shelters were, and a lot of organizations were better funded through state and feds. And so foundations sort of started to think they didn't have to fund it. And now we've had to sort of go back and say, well, the government isn't stepping in here. So I think it is, I think it's really important to help people, exactly what you just said, Jered, help people understand that. And understand that, in fact, we need philanthropic support. We need the kindness of strangers. And, the hope is that one day we won't need the kindness of strangers. But I think that, all of your donors should know that you're not being, that in fact you need their dollars to keep going. That's my opinion on it.
Several years ago, the U.S. bishops wrote this letter called A Place at the Table. And it was about just what you were saying, Joanne, that the table has 4 legs. And to help a person out of poverty, you need each of those legs. You need the individual to help, right? You need government. You need religious organizations and nonprofits, and then the business world. And each has a responsibility, and not one can do it on their own.
Yep.
I see I know I said put the questions in the Q&A, but I did see a little bit of a chain going on in regards to language barriers in either receiving services or just in general as language barriers keeping folks in poverty. Does anybody want to comment on that?
That's not something that we touch on in the book. There are a variety there are a lot of really big things that we didn't get to. There are just too many problems. I think that, yeah, personally, I don't know of any in the Hartford area.
Well, we certainly talked earlier about the need for immigration reform, and that would certainly help folks get access to jobs, et cetera.
I think for employment purposes, I think, language can definitely be a barrier, whether, it's Spanish speaking or otherwise, or even whether you have the ability to speak at all. And so we find that often for some of the folks that we're working with, getting access to meaningful jobs that will help them overcome their housing crisis and their challenge is often a large barrier. And many of them will, especially I would say folks who are monolingual or Spanish speaking monolingual folks, will often work together in different types of jobs where they're able to associate, and whether it's different factories locally here in Waterbury and things like that. But it is a great challenge for us to be able to try to provide services to those individuals who are monolingual. And especially because if you're Spanish speaking, you might have a little greater access to folks that are Spanish speaking with employment services and others. But if you're, say, Albanian or other, right, good luck, right? Which makes it even that much harder. So thankfully we have, people are more able to speak Spanish than many other different languages. So if you're not, Spanish speaking, good luck.
And to add to that, one of the things that I think a lot of immigrants fear is what's called the public charge issue. People have heard that if they access any services, that will sort of be held against them when it comes time to look at green card or citizenship. And so I think that's another factor in terms of people who don't speak English accessing services to learn, because they are afraid of that. And they're told, and there is an issue of public charge, and it is very difficult to know sort of what counts and what doesn't. So I think that also scares people away.
And in regards to speaking, I was thinking about using your voice. You use that language a lot in your book, that we need to use our voice. We need to advocate. I know I've had my own experiences of taking some folks up onto the Hill and to use your voice to advocate for certain policies. And it's a challenging experience, but then once you get used to it, it's very rewarding. And maybe Colleen or Joanne would like to share a little bit about, like, what's your experience been in regard to advocacy?
So we both had a lot of it. You want to start?
You go first, Colleen. You're good.
My whole voice issue started when I was a very little girl. My mom was a waitress, worked really, really hard to support us. Every night, her feet hurt like crazy. She would soak them in Epsom salts. And one night when I was on the floor playing, I saw that the basin had filled with blood because she'd had blisters and calluses that had cracked. And I remember thinking to myself really clearly, people must not know how hard her life is, or they would help her. So when I grow up, I'm going to write stories about people like Mom, so everybody will know. And I attempted to do as much. As you said in your intro, I was a journalist, and got in trouble for writing too many stories about poor people. And I was told that I should stop that. And I remember yelling at my editor, "That's not Christian and I won't do it." And so I quit and started working in a soup kitchen. And worked a lot in advocacy, have worked in advocacy in juvenile justice, particularly around the country, where it's been my great pleasure not only to advocate myself, but to help people who have lived through the system find their voices and get the support they need to talk to a bunch of legislators. I think that that's one of the most valuable things that if you work with marginalized and oppressed people that you can do, is not just to be a voice yourself, but to get those other voices that just haven't been part of the conversation out there, to give people a platform to speak. That's been the most rewarding work that I've done.
And, you know, it's funny because so I started the New Haven Diaper Bank in 2004. And we had our first federal bill in 2011. And so in that time, we now have had federal bills introduced nearly every year. We have a number of states that have added diapers to their to programs that they support. You know, we've had diapers written into different funding streams. We have spent all of this time where at the beginning, nobody knew what we were talking about and people really laughed at us or made fun of us. And now, almost 20 years later, it's regularly being talked about when we talk about poverty in the United States. So I think one thing about advocacy is that it just takes a really long time. And you have to be able to sort of set your sights appropriately. I think the other thing about it, it's incredibly empowering. I mean, it is the greatest feeling, I think, to get to go and tell somebody who is your representative, and that is what they're elected to do, is to represent you, to go and tell them what you think that's important, and hear what they think and hear how they plan to make the change that you elected them to make. You know, and at the National Diaper Bank Network, we host a lobby day every year in DC where we bring our members from all over the country down to DC. We do training on how to lobby and all of that, and then also set up meetings with representatives that represent the different diaper banks so that they learn about that and then can bring it back to their communities and help the families that they serve and the agency that they work with to begin to do that more as well.
Yeah, Jered, I know you've done a lot of advocacy as well.
Yeah, I think it's also important to realize that your legislators may not be as well versed on a topic that you think that they are. And so sometimes some of the basics, just having basic conversations is really important because you might have some information that they don't have and might be a subject matter expert on a certain piece of legislation that they're not. And so ensuring that you're advocating for that legislation or you're talking about different systems and services in a different way to them might give them the aha moment that really might make the difference. So I would say that don't assume that your legislator or congressperson knows exactly the topic that you're concerned or passionate about. To make sure that you are sending the emails, the phone calls, talking to their aides. And so sometimes it doesn't initially mean that you have to actually talk to the legislator or the congressperson, but sometimes their aides and other folks. But definitely do it. I'm pretty fortunate that I am able to speak to the Waterbury delegation at least monthly. And so I have a meeting with all of them pretty regularly, both individually, but also as a group, which is great. And then a big proponent of reaching out to the federal delegation on a regular basis. And sometimes it's the quick phone calls, sometimes a quick text message. But once you formulate some of those relationships, it really does help to ensure that they have a greater picture of what you're advocating for.
Right. That's been my experience too, that building that relationship is important. And as you said, Jered, that meeting sometimes with the aide is even better than with the actual representative, because that representative or senator just wants, the photo and kind of a pat on the back, but the aide really is there to take notes and to listen to what you have to say. And often we've heard, when we've gone to legislate for policies in regards to poverty, they're like, you're the only folks that come and do that. Like you're advocating for things that don't affect you, that affect others. And they're always so very impressed by that. I can't emphasize enough as a social justice director how important advocacy is.
And so since it's the Archdiocese, I'd just like to add a plug as a Catholic that our individual parishes are great at doing the works of mercy, and we should be, and that's wonderful. But you can take it one step further. You can take pictures of the food drive and send it to your local elected officials and say that poverty is something that our community is called to care about, and we hope you are too. That's not crossing any line you shouldn't cross, but that's a voice they're not going to hear if you don't raise it.
And I'll do a little plug that each year at the end of January, many Catholic organizations hold what's called the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering. And this year it will be virtual again, but it's an opportunity where we hear different issues and we learn the advocacy policy points. And then we end with a visit on the Hill, which next year will be virtual. But in our upcoming newsletter, look for information about that. You could sign up to join, to attend those sessions, and then come with me on a virtual visit to our legislators. I do want to open it up to questions at this time. I know we've been kind of scanning through the chat, but if there are any questions, if you would please put them in the Q&A box, and our panelists will try to get to them. I do see a lot of interest in the book, and I know somebody put the link, and this is what it looks like, Broken America.
So Louise wrote, or Lewis, I'm sorry, it all seems to boil down to how bad the system is broken and works against those less fortunate. And so many do not understand or realize what it means to be poor or in poverty. That's exactly, yes, that is what we're saying, is that it's really hard. And America is so segregated that if you are not yourself poor or work in the field, you have no reason to have ever seen it. We really do keep things so separated.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, maybe you had a double meaning behind your title, Broken America. Is it, not just financially being broke, but systems being broken in America?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And the reason we have the subtitle, Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty, is because we really felt like that was the issue, that first people have to see it, then they can understand it, and only then can we really end it.
And we should not be resigned to poverty here in the richest country in human history, right? It's a choice. It's an artificial construct. We can end it. It's really just a matter of will. It wouldn't be that difficult. The child tax credit cut child poverty in half. And we're fighting like crazy to keep it going. Why would we be fighting? Isn't that just the best outcome ever? It's a matter of will. It's a matter of resolve. No one in this country needs to be poor.
And, we really don't think in writing this that we were, being Pollyanna. We really believe that it is possible to end poverty in the United States. It really is a matter of enough people caring and making it a major issue. 20 years ago, we knew climate change was bad, but we did not have the focus on it that we have now. And, we could do that with poverty if there were enough people who had the will.
And the subtitle again is Seeing, Understanding, and Ending Poverty. And certainly you helped us understand, and your book helps us understand. And seeing is getting out there, right? Going to St. Vincent de Paul mission and being with folks and listening to the stories. That's it's always been the message of our Pope too. Go to that periphery and be with people and listen to their stories, because when you're there, those stories will change your heart and will want you to help change policies.
I think it's also, yes, definitely come to the different agencies that are out there that are doing, this work, but, look to your neighbors, right, that are living in poverty that you may not even really think that are just barely making it, that are struggling, that, that might have the healthcare insurance, but yet have to pay the $20,000 copay bill that year. Uh, 2 years ago, we had our second child, our fourth child, and I had a hip replacement. That year, we spent $20,000 on out-of-pocket medical expenses that year. That's a huge hit, right? And so, many folks that are your neighbors around you that might live next door, and whether it's the apartment or the house or whatever it is, poverty looks very different in many different ways. And it doesn't necessarily mean the folks that are lining up at our soup kitchen and food pantries or at our shelters or at the diaper bank, right? There are many different ways that people are experiencing poverty, and being welcoming to them and accompanying them along the journey, I think is really important. As Catholics, we should be doing that. We should definitely not just our corporal works of mercy, but spiritual works of mercy, and praying for those folks that are struggling in poverty in a real way, and being present to them as a support system.
That's a really good point. There's a gentleman in my community who I've known is like an acquaintance. And it came to my attention that he has needed a hip replacement for the longest time and can barely walk. And he is on Medicare, which will pay for the hip replacement, but they won't do the hip replacement before he gets very expensive dental work done, which Medicare won't pay for. So he's in terrible pain and, not able to pay bills and so forth. So a bunch of folks in town got together and said, well, we'll find the money, we'll fundraise for you. And one of us said to him, why didn't you tell us sooner? Why did you suffer? And he said, I didn't think anybody would care. And that just made me so sad. We need to build communities where no one would ever think that nobody would care. And we're not nearly there yet. We need to reach out and embrace our neighbors in a way that we have not in this country.
Yeah, I think we have to do a better job of advocating to break down the stereotypes and stigma of poverty.
Yeah.
Which I think we fail. And I think that's a great way is we as Catholics, as a church, can do that. As we do our best to try to right the injustices and the evils of racism. I think there's other things that we can do as well in addition to that, which also fighting people with behavioral disabilities, intellectual disabilities. There's lots that we can do to advocate as a church to help break down some walls and barriers for different folks, and among them, obviously, of course, poverty.
Would anybody like to go around and perhaps just give us some closing remarks or words of encouragement in ministry?
So, I guess mine wouldn't be in ministry, but my closing remarks would be, you can do this. Anybody can. All that an advocate is, the way that Colleen and I define an advocate, is just someone who won't go away. That's all you need to be, is someone who cares and keeps fighting.
Okay, I'll go. It's important for the world, and it's important for our church. I think that our teachings around social justice are some of the best things that Catholicism brings to the world. And I think that that is a light that is too often hidden under a bushel. It's not what people think of when they think of our church. So I feel whenever I go out in the world and I do social justice, I do it very explicitly proclaiming that I'm doing this because I'm a Catholic. This is what my faith calls me to do. And I'd encourage you to think about doing that too, to sit with that and not separate your religious life from your social justice life, because they're one feeds the other.
And for all our listeners, that's pretty ecumenical thing we have in common, right? In our faith is to call for social justice. Jered, any last comments?
Yeah, and I agree with Colleen. I think, you know, the work that we do, especially sometimes we don't necessarily see the fruit of our labors, which can be draining at times, and we don't always get to see the reward that we always hope, or the end result that we've been longing for. And so sometimes we can come to a bit of despair and look at more of the challenges rather than the many little mini successes that happen every single day because of the great work that is being done. And I think it's really important to take a moment to not always look at necessarily always the bigger picture, but sometimes the little mini successes, the many miracles, the many blessings that are happening all around us to help keep us going. Because without us, and then who, right? So I would encourage folks to not necessarily feel weighed down by some of the heavy burdens and challenges that we're experiencing in the day-to-day work that we're doing, but take a look at the little blessings that we all experience every single day, and that really help keep me going. And I hope they will keep you going as well.
Well said by all our panelists. So I'd like to thank Joanne, Colleen, and Jered for joining us this evening. It has been a treat. I think we could continue these conversations for sure in regards to our church's best kept secret and our need to be involved in this. But I will say that the second Wednesday of each month, I have a discussion group. It's just a time where anybody who's involved in ministry would like to get together. And so on December 8th, our kind of topic of discussion will be kind of a follow-up to this presentation. So anyone who has been thinking about what they heard today or something that struck them in the book, please join us on December 8th. You will get information about that in your follow-up email. But thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.